Here he is, the man that looks better in a mustache than without.
Well, thank you very much. That's the kindest thing anyone said to me today.
You sent me your book and I really enjoyed it, but we'll get into that. But also you have two YouTube channels. One is your
Mhm.
jiu-jitsu and massive following.
I have a stupid bald head. You have a stupid bald head. Ah!
And then your
Mhm.
wilderness trip.
I was reading in the tent, and the latch had come off of the bear spray. So when I rolled over, it fired it off.
Not so much as the jiu-jitsu following. And you're a firefighter, your dad. Man, I started reading your book, and I'll just say right now I got a head cold, and I was at some show, and I probably shook too many hands. And then in a feverish dream, I actually read your book. And man, it is very emotional, very honest, very much your own character. I got to know who you were throughout the read. Tell me about, first of all,
I'm so sorry for you.
no, it was great. It was great. Let's start with you didn't have that great of life at times. You lost a
Mhm.
brother. He just, oh my Lord, the phone is on, and that's Tim Foley. Tim Foley, sorry, I'm busy interviewing people. That's kind of funny.
It's live. This is
It is,
live.
yeah. So yeah, so you lost your brother. He just fixed his
Mhm.
drug addiction, but then he went and got in a motorcycle accident. Very sad. You went through that, and then your other brother, because you had three other brothers, he drowned in a canoe accident, and that was
Yep.
just a pivotal moment in the book. I was like, whoa, man, for you looking for him, right? And
Yep.
then your other brother, you had a kidney disease, which you should talk about, and all of a sudden your third brother said, yeah, I'll give him a kidney because the doctor said, well,
Yeah.
this is it if you don't find one. So that's kind of cool. Anyway, I'm blabbing too much. I'm rambling too much. I haven't
Yeah.
done one of these whiskey chats for a while. And by the way, for whiskey chat, because I have a head cold, I'm having this glava with honey. Let's start off
It's
with honey.
medicinal.
Well, yeah, with
You
this, so
must be, you must have some Eastern European in you somewhere, because honestly, for any condition, if you talk to somebody who's Eastern European, oh, you have a canker sore? Here, have some vodka. Oh,
oh,
you have a fever? Have some vodka. Oh, you're too cold? Have some vodka.
it's true. It
It
doesn't
seems,
help. But my mother, when I was a wee infant, she would give us glava with honey if we had a head cold or
oh,
brandy. Yeah, it's Scottish and Irish, right? Probably just given his addiction. But anyway, so here's the thing. You had all those troubles in your life, but you had this canoe trip in your head for 26 years.
mm,
You wanted to do this
yeah,
and you had everything going on in your life that you couldn't do it. And it was a fixation with this trip. An amazing trip, by the way. And then all of a sudden, your brothers had died, your mother had died, you had the divorce, you had some money issues, and then all of a sudden you're like, it's the time to go. Your
yeah,
kidney is replaced by your good brother. So why the route? What's
yeah.
so special about that trip?
Well, I've always been fascinated by the North. I mean, I grew up in Ontario, so growing up in Ontario, you go to canoe camp and you lay the groundwork for a relationship to the outdoors. And I'd done a fair amount of canoe tripping in my youth, in my teens and in my 20s. My first major trip that I organized was into Quetico with a friend of mine. That's a fairly remote country. And then I ended up doing some solo trips up to James Bay on the Mississauga, and then coming back overland on the Kenogami and the Albany rivers back to Lake Superior. And so I had spent a significant amount of my youth in my 20s out in the bush with friends, by myself, guiding, raft guiding, canoe guiding. And it was very much part of who I was and my identity. But then life comes along, and life includes things like kids and jobs and divorces and remarriages and more work and side jobs and starting YouTube channels and all that crazy stuff. And even though I would go north whenever I could or go canoeing whenever I could, it was hard to get back to that giant block of time that you need to really go and do a spectacular trip. Now, when I was young, I did a longer trip that ended up on the Seal River in northern Manitoba. It's kind of what the biggest major river that runs just south of the Nunavut Manitoba border. And in doing that research, I came across this amazing map, the Land of Little Sticks map. And this is now my second copy because I burned out the first copy. And the Seal River's down here. But reading it, it's just got all these little details about Newton Lake and Ragnar Johansson and the land where P.G. Downes traveled. I see Eva's book in the back. And if you've read Farley Mowat, a lot of that adventure takes place in this land of little sticks, the border of the boreal forest and the tundra. Now, Farley Mowat is the storyteller, which is a kind way to say that he lied his face off, but he tells a great story, and it's kind of true in spirit. He didn't let the details get in the way of a good story. And so I'd grown up reading Farley Mowat. I'd read P.G. Downes. I'd read, Samuel Hearn's expedition to the Coppermine River where he crossed through this country. And it just seemed that I would absorb as much as I could about this. And so Newton Lake and the land north of Newton Lake had been calling to me. I mean, Newton Lake's an amazing lake. It's 150 kilometers long. It looks like a Jackson Pollock painting. It looks like somebody took a bunch of paint and threw it at a canvas. And you've got this lake with amazing, like, deep bays and just a plethora of islands. And you could get lost on that one really easy. And the southern part of it's in the trees and the northern part's in the tundra. So as you paddle north, you go from forest to tundra. So you paddle through that tree line. It's an amazing experience. It's a very difficult lake to paddle. I've paddled it twice now, and the last time I did it, I encountered 1 to 2 foot thick kilometers of ice in July.
Well, that's pretty solid. You're not getting through that without an icebreaker. I think there is a way to get around here, but this problem could get worse as I go further north. We'll see. Well, I made it through. I went around a little bit, and then I found a lead that I could punch through and got to the other side. Thankfully, it wasn't windy or wavy. If those blocks of ice had been moving up and down in the wind and the waves, there's no chance I would have attempted that. Those blocks of ice would have crushed me like a grape.
That's tough going. And there's wind and there's bears and there's waves and there's reach and all the other things you have to worry about. But it had been a constant, it had been kind of calling to me. And so having the brush with death, with a kidney failure from a genetic condition, and then the second lease on life, it really put things into perspective. And it changed the thing from, I'd really like to get up there someday, to what do I need to do to get up there? What changes do I need to make? What systems would I need to put in place? What would I need to organize to go do this trip that I had been thinking about in general terms for a really long time? And then I started looking at maps. And once you start looking at maps, you're screwed. Once you that's a slippery rabbit hole that leads down to trips. And you start going, I wonder if you can go from here to there. And in the Canadian Shield, you probably can go from here to there. But the question is, how easy is it going to be? And is it an elegant route? But you can get from here to there in the Canadian Shield. It's an amazing, amazing landform.
Well, the connection of waterways is amazing. The history is amazing. And the books that you read beforehand, I bought those books too. And I was like, dreaming of the area you were going through. It was a tough slog though. You had winds, you were going solo, which I love the idea of. You said you were alone, but not lonely. I love that part of the book. Mm-hmm. You explained the whole idea of that. But yeah, you had, bad bugs, and you had a lot of bear encounters, like more than.
Yeah.
It's coming this way. Not far, man.
People fixate on the bears, right? You start in black bear country, you go into grizzly bear country, you end up in polar bear country, and for sure you have to take precautions. 100%. You'd be an idiot not to And yeah, I had a couple kind of worrying encounters, but the real danger, as longtime paddlers know, in that country, is traveling the large lakes. The large lakes and getting blown into the middle. If you get blown into the middle of a 40-kilometer wide lake in a storm, you're dead. Like there's no paddling technique, there's no bailer, there's no PFD that's going to keep you alive. You're dead. And whereas you run into a bear, yeah, there's a whole layer of precaution that you can take, or many layers of precautions. And I'm not saying you should take it, you should underplay that danger, but statistically, drowning in large cold bodies of water is by far the biggest hazard.
Well, let's look at that. The choice of your boat. That was really interesting. It was an open deck kayak, or it wasn't a kayak, it was a closed deck canoe.
Yeah, it's like it's a C1. It's a boat built by Clipper Canoes out here on the West Coast. So it's kind of, imagine a sea kayak with an open top, so it's easier to load and unload stuff. It's so you can't roll it, but it is faster. It's faster than a canoe, so it's 17 feet 6 inches long. So it's faster than a canoe, a little bit more wave worthy than a canoe because the front deck is covered. So if it dives down into water, a little bit concerning to see the bow of your boat disappear underwater, but then it comes up. It has a rudder, which the purist in me was like, I don't know about this. But honestly, when you're fighting a headwind, trying to stay on course, and you've been going for 10 hours, at that point, your purism goes out the window. Single-bladed paddle, double-bladed paddle, I don't care. Rudder, no rudder. I want the rudder, please. Like there's no purity anymore. Let's just get across this bloody lake and get to that campsite. So yeah, it had advantages and disadvantages. It's a little bit harder to load and unload. So if you have a lot of portages and you have a lot of gear, stuffing everything into the nooks and crannies, it just takes an extra time. I mean, a prospector, great. You got your pack, you chuck it in, maybe you tie it in, and then you go. It takes 30 seconds to unload a boat. But with a more covered boat, it takes a lot longer. But you have a bit more security in the waves. But it doesn't have as much rocker, so turning in whitewater is harder. But if you're running big waves in whitewater, you don't have to worry about swamping as much. So it was a compromise. And the other big thing to think about is if you're going into a remote community up north, you got to either abandon your boat up there or fly it out. In 5 years ago, flying that boat out from Arviat cost $2,500, which is almost half the cost of the boat. Now, I made the decision to fly it out. Silly me, I was emotionally attached to the boat, so I bought it for about $5K, flew it out for about $2.5K, and then spent about $1,000 repairing it from the damage the trip had done, because the hull had to be redone. There was a fair amount of damage over 1,000 miles of rough terrain, and some encounters with rocks in whitewater. So there's a sentimental attachment, and I think it's hard to avoid a sentimental attachment to a boat when you spend so many hours sitting in it. I'm sure you're the same way. You probably hung on to boats way too long.
Yeah, that's a problem with me. The Passaway trip I did that last summer, we could have left the canoe there and even made money on it because they wanted the canoes left at the lodge so they can use them. And I went, no, this canoe's not being left. So yeah. Did you make the right choice with that canoe then?
I think so. I've started experimenting with pack boats, which are boats that fold up. It's an amazing construction with aluminum frame and then a thick vinyl skin that goes over it. So you can pack it down into a large duffel bag. And that makes flying in and flying out easier and cheaper because a lot of pilots, they won't take external loads anymore. I think maybe it depends on their insurance. I'm not exactly sure, but some will take them, some won't. And shipping a duffel bag that weighs 60 pounds is so much cheaper than shipping a 17 or 18 foot long boat that weighs 60 pounds. So, and those pack boats are really good in whitewater because they bend a little bit. So Cliff Jacobson wrote about this in a book. And I was like, yeah, sure they do. Oh, no, you can actually feel it. flex a little bit and like, ooh, I'm going to take in water in this wave. And nope, it bends just enough to go over top of it. But they don't track as well. And they're not as fast in waves. It can take, if there's big waves and big wind, then it can take almost twice as long to cross a given area. So I think I made the right decision. There's no perfect boat. If you're doing a varied trip, which has got lakes and upriver travel and downriver travel and whitewater and portaging and lining and poling and tracking and dragging, then there is no perfect boat. For dragging, you want the indestructible boat built of, I don't know, the slipperiest material known to man. For poling, you want something super stable. For whitewater, you want something agile, but there's no perfect boat.
Did you ever figure out what was wrong with your hand?
Oh, so a couple days into the trip, my hand swelled up to the size of a grapefruit. And I was in northern Saskatchewan at that point, past the roads on the Churchill River, because I went down the Churchill River initially, then up the Reindeer River, then across Reindeer Lake, and then further north. And the hand just swelled up to the size of a grapefruit. And there were two options. One is there's some kind of infection in the hand. And the other is it's some kind of overuse injury that is caused by just taking thousands and thousands of paddle strokes a day. And so I didn't know what to do. Should I turn around? I don't want to do that. Should I continue? Well, I'll get deeper into trouble if something really bad happens. So I decided to split the difference and start taking antibiotics. And either the antibiotics would help or they wouldn't. And they'd at least be prophylaxis against the worst case scenario, would be some kind of, I don't know, flesh-eating disease. And it turned out that I think it was just an overuse injury. Something tore, something strained, and over the course of the next week, the hand went back to sort of normal shape. It was very strange. I don't really know what happened to it. It's amazing how paddling can be really therapeutic. I went into that trip with two bad shoulders. I had just injured both shoulders, one doing jiu-jitsu and one racing my kid on a skateboard, which is stupid but fun. And I was really quite worried about it because I hadn't been able to do the paddling that I wanted to do to prepare, just to get the volume of training in, kind of approaching it like running an ultra marathon. So that made certain aspects of the trip difficult. But at the same time, that 20 or 30,000 strokes a day is just motion, and it brings blood to the area and it gets circulation going. And my shoulders got better. Other parts of my body fell apart. I hadn't done the physical prep needed, and I've since dialed those things in a little bit. If you're going to be basically in a sitting position all day long for an easy trip, if you're going with friends and family, you're just going to poke around a lake, or the idea is to camp, no problem. You don't need to do extensive prep. But if you're going on a trip where you have a deadline and you've got an ambitious distance to cover, that's a very different animal. And there, I think you have to approach it more a little bit like an athlete trying to prepare for it. Those are two very different modalities. Just like going alone is one modality, and going with other people is a different modality. And you kind of have to deploy different tools and different mindsets for those two activities.
You talked a lot about the past with that too. Examples of certain athletes you knew and respected, and how they would get through things. I really like that part of the book where you actually went beyond the trip of just going from A to B, and then went back in time to talk about how you learned through the past. And when you're a firefighter, and one of your chiefs actually just would breathe heavy before they went into the fight, right? And they would just calm down, even though they might be full of anxiety. They would calm down. The other is you talked about. Think about it. If it's black smoke and there's no way to saving anybody there, don't jump in and save anybody. But if there's a bunch of kids in the house, then you will jump in and save. So all those things were going through your mind on this trip. Do you think a solo trip like that brings out all that? Do you think a lot when you're out there?
Yes. There's kind of there's different levels of thinking. There's the procedural thinking that most of your day is occupied with. Most of your day at least when you're on a reasonably difficult trip, is spent going, I wonder if I should go left or right of that island ahead, given that the wind is coming from the west. But yesterday, the wind shifted more to the north as the day went on, and I see these kind of clouds, and the shape of the waves here suggests that there's some shallower uh, water here. But over there, if the wind shifts, now I'm going to get hit. You're just thinking about the consequences of your actions all day long. And you're thinking about, oh, my back is hurting a little bit. Maybe I should extend my leg and change my position. And have I eaten recently? And am I getting cold? Because I don't want to get hypothermia. And when should I reapply sunscreen? And your mind is kind of filled with these little procedural things. And ultimately, you're trying to mitigate risk with all those things, or at least risk mitigation on a difficult trip is a huge part of the thinking process. I mean, taking risk is different when it's just you and when you have kids. I would, in a different life, I could have been an alpinist when I didn't have kids. In a different life, I might have taken a stab at climbing Everest or climbing other peaks. But instead I went into paddling and canoeing, which is less dangerous. To quote Rick Driediger, who used to run Horizons Unlimited and Churchill River Canoe Outfitters, I can swim, but I can't fly. So that's a succinct way of summing up why I went more the paddling route. But it's useful for thinking about risk in terms of, I believe you have the right to take risks for yourself. If you want to, there's actually a better argument for driving without seatbelts. Think of driving without a seatbelt versus driving drunk. If you drive without a seatbelt, then you get in a terrible accident, probably you're mostly going to hurt yourself. Yeah, there are some knock-on effects, like the first responders responding might be more traumatized by a more grisly scene if you've gone through the windshield. And there's a chance that when you go through that windshield, you could hit somebody. But by and large, driving without a seatbelt, the consequences mostly come back on you. Whereas drunk driving, the odds of you hitting somebody else who didn't consent to being part of your drunk driving experiment are pretty high. Or another example would be smoking in public spaces, right? I think you should have the right to smoke. I definitely don't think you should have the right to smoke in the restaurant that I'm sitting in, because now the risks that you're taking are being transferred onto me. So thinking about risk is something that I do all the time when I'm outdoor, and especially in the context of I have kids and I have some level of responsibility, quite a lot of responsibility, come back to them. So, when you're thinking about, should I run this rapid or should I attempt this crossing, I have to factor their existence into my risk map. And the other level of thinking, so that's all the monkey mind being occupied in the minutia of, should I put my foot here or there when I'm trying to drag my boat up a rapid? Then there's occupying the mind and the body with all that stuff allows other processes to run deeper. So in dealing with things like the death of two brothers and a mother, watching my grandmother die, and trying to figure out, what am I going to do now that I've finished my undergrad? Do I really want to go back to university and do another degree and, go back and, spend more time in classrooms? And that was a pretty big existential crisis for me at some point when I finished my undergrad. But what did I do? I went out in the bush by myself for a solo trip. And I wasn't thinking about it continuously, but it was on my mind. So it kind of that subroutine runs at a deeper level while your mind and your body are occupied with the minutia of day-to-day living, to some extent, day-to-day survival, risk management. And by the end of that trip, I had an answer. It wasn't like I had sat there and pondered deeply and made pros and con lists, but it was on my mind, and occupying the sort of conscious mind a little bit allowed those deeper thoughts to percolate, come up with an answer. Or in the case of when dealing with my brothers, it allowed mourning to happen. it provided the space for that in a very strange way. I've used the analogy of it's like a monk cutting bamboo to achieve enlightenment, or a monk raking gravel to achieve enlightenment. Those are mundane activities, but the goal is to get to a deeper place. I'm not saying I've reached enlightenment, but I'm saying I have used those processes to do things like mourn and make really big decisions and come to peace with difficult processes. And ultimately, I mean, I guess that trip that I described in the book was a way of dealing with my own mortality and thinking about my own death and my own brush with death and realigning what's important.
Did you have to be alone for that?
I find it much easier to do that alone. I think everybody's different. I don't think that most normal people should jump in a canoe and do a 1,000-mile solo trip across terra incognita anytime if they're dealing with the death of a pet. But that's probably how I would deal with the death of a dearly beloved pet. So I think being alone helps. A couple of years ago, I did the Camino de Santiago. Now, I did it with my kids. So again, that is, my mind is spent, oh, that one's getting hungry. That one's going to get cold. That one's bike broke again. This one's knee is hurting. And so it wasn't about me, it was about them. But on that trip, I did run into a fair number of people who were clearly traveling. And so the Camino de Santiago are these, call it a network of trails in Europe that lead to a pilgrimage site in Spain. And there's a ton of infrastructure there. So hostels and restaurants. So it's not super rugged, but it does provide walking time and contemplation time. And other people, not me, because I was obsessed with, my kids not wandering off into traffic, but other people were definitely there to have that contemplative experience. And they'd have time with people together in the hostels and the restaurants, and then they would go their own separate way and they would walk alone for a day. So clearly that's what they were trying to achieve. I think everybody's route to contemplation and understanding is different.
That's good. That was really interesting. I didn't know you did that. I'm supposed to keep to a script, man. I haven't come close. I'm not even going to ask that question. I thought about asking that question because people would be interested. But like you said, open water is more dangerous than bears. But you did talk about bear spray versus a shotgun. You had both. And I remember watching your videos, which is great because you have a video series on this too. Whereas it all depends on the moment, where bear spray is good at the very last moment. So you want to explain that? Because it happened a couple of times where bear came in your camp.
Sure. So, I mean, bear safety is a multi-layered thing. And if you're at the stage of staring down a shotgun barrel at a bear, odds are you've probably screwed it up a couple of steps back. Not always, but so the first step is avoiding bears, right? Not going where if you have a choice and you see a beach that's just full of bear tracks and logs torn apart, or hunting lodges, or old campsites that clearly have a lot of garbage, or fly-in fishermen sites are some of the worst, because when fly-in fishermen land on a lake, they catch a bunch of fish, they cook a bunch of bacon, they leave fish guts everywhere, and bears learn. Bears are really smart, and bears go, oh yeah, I should go by this place on my rounds because there's a pretty good chance I'm going to find some absolutely delicious fish guts or cans of beans or whatever. So try to avoid those places. It's not always possible. Not always possible because sometimes there's really only one campsite in the last 5 hours of traveling, and you get a choice of sleeping in your boat, which is a lot less fun than it sounds, or camping at this campsite where there's obvious bear sign. But try to avoid that. Step 2, keep a really clean camp. Do not cook where you eat. Do not cook where you sleep. Try and cook 100 or 200 feet away. Do not store your bags near your tent. I up north where the trees aren't tall enough to hang anything. I don't know what you do, but I usually divide my food in 2 bags and stash them in different directions in the bush. That way, if a bear finds one of them and carries it off, probably won't find the other one, and I'll have at least half my food. And of course, try and keep smell to an absolute minimum. Try to waterproof it, and plastic bags and inside thick waterproof bags. And yeah, a bear is curious, it'll tear it apart, but at least it won't be led. If you've hid that bag in a little hollow and covered up with a few branches, at least the bear won't be following his nose to eat your delicious bacon or whatever. So minimizing smell. Now, more physical measures, I like using it's called a pack alarm. It's a little grenade-sized spool that you can buy online, where you string a line around your tent and set up this alarm. A pretty loud siren. I know they work because I've set it off. I've had caribou set it off. I've had birds set it off. I've never had a bear set it off, but at least I'm fairly certain that a bear won't sneak up on me. And honestly, a siren going off as a bear's investigating a tent will probably frighten it off. In terms of defending yourself, which is now like the fourth or fifth layer that we're talking about, there is some data on bear spray versus firearms. Now, that's a false dichotomy. You can take both, and in some situations, you should take both. But the data that's out there, based on 4 different studies that I looked at, the only 4 I could find, and 2 of them aren't very good, but all 4 kind of agreed that in the aggregate, accounting for everything, bear spray is a little bit more effective than a firearm. And I personally think that's because if you're a bear and you're right in front of me and I pull up my bear spray and I fire it off to the side, it's still going to create that cloud of noxious capsicum. And bears have a sense of smell that's 100 times better than ours. And so, yeah, it's still going to have some effect. I mean, there was a guy who was getting mauled by a bear. I think it was last summer. He pulled out his bear spray, but it was too late. So he covered his head, or he covered his neck as it was chewing on him, and it chewed through the bear spray, and poof, it popped open, and that frightened the bear away. So he got injured, but he survived. Now, it's amazing how upset the American Second Amendment crowd gets when you say, statistically speaking, the bear spray tends to work a little bit better than a firearm because, well, American Second Amendment types is the truth. And I own a gun. I own a couple of guns, and I take them. And I'm not saying don't take them, but if you only had to take one, I would take the bear spray, except maybe in the tundra, because up above tree line, there's so much wind that it could really cut down on your options if the bear's coming at you from upwind. So that's another consideration.
Well, that's a lot of experience talking right there. That's fantastic. We're running out of time.
I take both. Okay.
We always run out of time, but I want to get to this some really solid questions at the end. I love the idea you brought 3 paddles because one broke right off the bat. Because some people don't even bring a spare paddle. I love the idea. Well, I didn't love the idea. I felt so bad for you when your maps got soaking wet, but you did actually laminate them and they weren't wet. That was a bad scene. It's like, oh man.
Yeah.
The bear spray going off in your tent and you had to wash your tent. Man, that's an incredible moment. But I've asked you why solo, whatever. But the one thing you taught yourself and inspired yourself to get out by Bill Mason, which I love because that's how I got out going. I would watch the same films, read the same books that you were talking about in your book, and that's how I got out. So, could you explain first of all to people out there who is Bill Mason or who was Bill Mason and why did that inspire you?
Yeah. So Bill Mason, for anyone who doesn't know, is kind of the godfather of Canadian canoeing. I think that's totally fair. He was Canadian. He was in the Ottawa area. He was an environmentalist. He was fanatical about canoeing. He produced a book called Path of the Paddle. And I came across this book. I was loaned it by a friend of the family. And it's basically a how-to paddle book, nominally. Here's how to do a draw. Here's how to do a pry. Here's how to do an eddy turn. Here's the basics of doing a ferrying and, very practical. but it's a Trojan horse, because really what sings on every single page is his absolute love of the wilderness, his love of canoeing. And I think, he saw it as the perfect human creation. And being able to connect to nature through canoeing. And then, of course, he wrote another book, Song of the Paddle, which is more about the camping aspect. And some of that's a little bit outdated, and I don't agree with everything he said, but it doesn't matter because the passion is there and the love of the wilderness is there. I mean, I remember on that trip in Quetico that I did, the first trip that I organized, sitting above a rapid with my buddy that I was going with, and we had Path of the Paddle open, and we're like trying to figure out, now, is that a souse hole? And trying to plan a route through the rapids based on his instructions, and we totally blew it. Doesn't matter. We survived.
That's amazing because I went through the same thing. So yeah, we're just on the last minute here, and it's funny. Did you hear my dog threw up in the background?
Oh no!
It just threw up. Well, actually, not Oliver, not my dog. Yeah. So the book will be out soon, and it's amazing. I read a pre-copy, whatever, and yeah, and we got 1 minute left. But what's next? What's next for you?
I don't know. I'm in limbo this summer. I know that I'm going to be doing some kind of trip. I'm just waiting to hear back on a couple of family things. So there will be other trips, but certainly in the next month, I'm going to be doing a whole lot of bookstore readings and presentations and podcasts, and yeah, producing this book, Perseverance: Life and Death in Subarctic by Stephan Kesting.
That's awesome.
How's that for subtle?
It's a great read. And I'm going to read it again when I don't have a feverish dream.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to read it.
Oh, no problem. And cheers. I didn't even have any of this, like getting rid of my cold. But yeah, thanks for the time.
Thank you for writing books like this, Kevin. I enjoyed them.
Yes. That was my worst seller.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Oh, the media loved it. The media loved it, but it was worst seller. But yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks. For this whiskey chat, a big thanks goes out to my sponsors, my friends, Explorer Magazine, Canadian Outdoor Equipment, Recreational Barrel Works, Adventure Medical Kits, Novacraft Canoe, Badger Paddles, and Algonquin Outfitters. Thanks, everyone.